Hello, I'm Sarah Thompson-Copsey and I'd like to welcome you to today's Legal Futures webinar, Adverse Possession, Boundary Disputes and Trespass. We're going to be looking at all three of those topics during the course of this webinar. Obviously, we're only going to be looking at all three of them quite briefly, but they're very, very linked together, these topics, because quite often what will happen in the case of a dispute between neighbours is it may often start with a claim that the next door neighbour, commercial or residential, normally residential of course, because that's where you tend to get more of the sort of emotion involved. A neighbour will say that my neighbour next door has put the fence in the wrong place, put the hedge in the wrong place, leaned a ladder over my property. And all of that will revolve around the concepts of trespass, adverse possession and boundaries. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. So these are often disputes that start, as I say, being disputes about walls or fences or hedges, or has the shed actually trespassed my neighbour's shed? Is it now in actually part of my land? And so these often start as allegations of my neighbour has effectively encroached onto my land, and we would call that trespass. And when looking at a claim like that, our first question to be asked really is, well, is it actually your land that you say that the neighbour is on? And that means looking at the boundary position between your client and your client's neighbour. And it also means considering whether, even if it appears on the face of it that the neighbour has trespassed by utilising land that is within your client's boundary, has that utilisation of that land, if I can put it like that, been for such a long period that adverse possession might be claimed? So we're going to look at all of these in turn. Very briefly, we're going to be looking at trespass. And here we're not talking about public trespass. We're not talking about travellers arriving on land in common quite often. Here we're talking about trespass in a much more domestic, private setting. And so we're going to look at it very much from the perspective of private disputes. In fact, all of this is going to be looked at very much from the perspective of private disputes. But whilst boundaries and adverse possession can easily apply, what we're going to look at today can easily apply for commercial property, we're going to be looking less at commercial property when it comes to trespass. So we're going to start by looking at trespass, and we're looking at it very much from a neighbour perspective. So we'll start with trespass, we'll move on to boundaries, and then we'll look at adverse possession. And we'll spend quite a lot of time looking at factual possession, intention to possess, and no consent, the definition of adverse possession. And then we'll look at the two regimes and what that actually means for your client, if your client's land is in adverse possession, or if your client is in fact the adverse possessor, or rather the squatter, as the courts will call your client in those circumstances. So we'll look at the two regimes and very briefly what it is you're going to be thinking about when it comes to dealing with land subject to or about to be subject to a claim for adverse possession.